Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our keynote panel of the LSX Nordic Congress today. I'm delighted to be joined and be moderating this session, which is focused on the Nordic ecosystem, some of the success stories that have come out over the last 18 months, and really on the sector as a whole, which, as the session outlined, sort of lends to, I think it's been a bit of a step change for the Nordic region, a lot of success stories to talk about, and delighted to be joined by a number of companies who have passed a lot of interesting milestones and contributed to that growth and success. So again, I would just like to remind and ask everyone to please put your questions in the bottom right in the live discussion. There is a little box that says live discussion. If you click on that, and then there's the chat and questions function. So please post any comments or questions in there, and we'll get to them throughout the panel discussion and at the end. But for now, I'd be delighted to introduce our panel this morning. And rather than me introducing them, I'd like them to introduce themselves. So perhaps I could first hand over to you, Martin.
Yes, thank you very much, Josh, and happy to participate. So just a quick introduction to myself and the company. I'm the CEO of BioInvent since August 2018, so it's now a little bit more than 3 years. And BioInvent obviously is around for quite some time. We are a clinical stage company listed on the Stockholm Stock Exchange based in Lund. And we're pushing ahead with a very broad portfolio within immuno-oncology.
Thank you, Martin. And Renee?
Absolutely. Nice to be here. So I am Renee Aguiar-Lucander. I'm the CEO of Gilead Therapeutics. I've been here for just over 4 years. And we are listed on both in Stockholm as well as in the US on NASDAQ. Company's a late-stage biopharma company focused on orphan indications and nephrology. And our lead compound is last year read out a positive phase 3 trial in a kidney disease called IgA nephropathy, which is a rare disease. We're presently in filing discussions, or basically in regulatory discussions. We have filed for approval both in Europe and in the US. And we also have a pipeline in terms of NOX inhibitors, which are following suit.
Fantastic. And last but certainly not least, Anders.
Thanks, Josh. So my name is Anders Martin-Löf. I'm the CFO of Oncopeptides since about 3 years. And Oncopeptides is focusing on hematology. We have a drug that was launched in March in the US that is called melflufen, or Pepaxto is the brand name in the US. So we're in the middle of the launch process there, and we have also submitted for approval in Europe as well, and they're expecting approval in the second quarter of next year for Europe.
Fantastic. So yeah, we, as I said, have a sort of a panel of leading biotech companies who have passed a number of significant milestones. So perhaps if I could turn to you first, Martin. I'd like to invite you to share a little bit about some of those milestones at BioInvent, your significant share issue, and also the collaboration and partnership deals that you've announced over the last 18 months or so.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do so. So actually 2020 and 2021 was very active for BioInvent. So we did 2 nice financings. So one in late summer of 2020, and then Q1 this year, another one, which raised around 200 million US. And really a nice mix of shareholders, including large investors from the US, Redmile, Consonance, but also from Europe, HBM, Omega, etc. in those. So that was very good. And of course, that gave us a lot of stability, such that we could use the money in order to really push ahead with our compounds. And as I said already initially, so we're pushing ahead with a broad portfolio. We have current 4 clinical trials ongoing. By the end of the year, we will have a 5th one, all first in class. And then we had a couple of important milestones in that sense, that we published some data during Q1 this year regarding our lead compound, where we could show nice first signs of efficacy, so good overall response, as well as duration of response, which of course was very important. And then we initiated trials around our second and third program, BI-1808 and BT-001. And then last but not least, we did a lot of partnering. So October last year, we did a deal for China, Taiwan, Macau, and Hong Kong. with CASI Pharmaceuticals, giving them the exclusive rights to 1206, BR-1206, which is our lead compound. And then we just recently implemented our second clinical supply and collaboration agreement with Merck. So as I said, very active, and we will remain active throughout the year and of course the coming years since we have a portfolio.
Fantastic. And I'm intrigued to dig a little bit more later on into particularly the China deal and some of the challenges of doing some of these partnerships with the last 18 months or so, and some of the struggles we've had with connecting and traveling and things like that. But over to Renee now. It feels like a very exciting time for Calliditas, starting with your listing that you mentioned to US NASDAQ. But maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what's been keeping you busy, and I guess the underlying strategy behind everything that you've been doing and the successes you've had over the last 18 months or so.
Sure. So yes, obviously in June of 2020, we did a dual listing in the US. It was a very successful deal. We added a lot of kind of strong long-only shareholders in the US. And also really kind of the reason why we really listed in the US was for strategic reasons. We did know obviously that our lead compound was going to read out during this period of time. And if it was a positive readout, then the strategy has always been to commercialize ourselves in the US. So we had been and continue to kind of build up an organization in the US. And today, obviously, that is a fully fledged kind of commercial operation in place. So that was really the reason, the kind of strategic reason kind of behind why we wanted to kind of go into the US and raise money there. It is going to become kind of our home market, post-launch of an approved product. So that was really one of the reasons. And then after that, we have continued to do both kind of capital raisings and partnerships. We did a debt deal this year with Creos, and we have a credit accessibility of about $75 million under that transaction. And we also entered into a European partnerships, because again, our strategy has always been to commercialize ourselves in the US, but partner ex-US. So we already had a Chinese partnership that we entered into earlier. And so this is really kind of a commercial partnering deal that we closed in this summer. And so we read out, obviously, from another kind of, what's keeping me busy is obviously we read out the phase 3 in November of last year. And we then filed with the FDA in March and with EMA in May of this year. And we also, obviously, during this period of time, we also made an acquisition in the form of Genkyotex. We wanted to add to our kind of, to the breadth and stability of the company, and therefore we've also made it very clear we want to build and broaden the platform, still with the focus on kind of orphan indications and nephrology. And this is actually when we added kind of the platform for NACSIB, so actually the NOX inhibitor platform, and that's been kind of an ongoing transaction due to the fact that it's a public company, and public takeovers tend to not be done kind of overnight, and so they do take a little while to complete. But that's really been the kind of final transaction that we've been doing during these kind of 18 months.
Quite a busy time, and I'm quite intrigued to dig in a little bit later on, and maybe into this first launch trend and self-commercialization journey that I think is quite an interesting trend that we're seeing across the industry, really, particularly in sort of oncology and rare disease and cell gene therapy. But as another example of that, over to you, Anders. You mentioned Pepaxto and the launch there. So and also I understand you've been going through quite a large US expansion yourself. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's been a tense year and a half, to say the least. We issued the data from our Horizon trial last spring, and we were planning to raise money based on that. So end of February, we were planning to go on road shows to raise money to start really to build up the commercial build up. And then COVID hit, so it was really tense spring, but we managed to pull off the financing in May. And then in July, we got the new CEO in place, based in Boston. That shouldn't be a problem. He should be able to travel to Stockholm. Just wait a couple of months until the virus has passed. But I finally met him yesterday for the first time. So it took a little bit longer than expected. But then last summer, we really started building our commercial organization earnestly after having filed in June for accelerated approval. So in 2020, I think our organization grew from roughly 80 people to 280 in the COVID era. And then finally in February, we got our approval in the US, accelerated approval in multiple myeloma, and launched the product in March, and then applied for approval as well in Europe in April. But then we released our data from our confirmatory phase 3 trial, that where the initial readout was that we did almost reached our primary endpoint, but not really. And then later on, it turned out that we did reach our primary endpoint, and we did show superiority against Pomalyst, which is a $3 billion drug. However, then the FDA had already started looking into this, and then they issued a clinical hold, and later on a safety alert. So now it's a bit tough again, and now we are working on presenting the data from the study, which are actually really, really strong, but we haven't been able to present them until now because this is the first scientific meeting where we can do that. And then we are headed for an advisory committee meeting with the FDA late October. So it's really been lots of ups and downs lately, and just a crazy period, but also a lot of success as well. But right now it's a bit tough, but I'm hopeful that we will be able to ride out this storm as well.
Fantastic. And I guess a question that I'd like to direct to all of you, but maybe coming straight back to you, Anders, as you mentioned some of those challenges of the pandemic, and quite a big sort of build out of your team in the US that you weren't able to oversee as you might normally have done, and only meeting your CEO yesterday for the first time in over a year since joining forces there. So I guess the question is assessing the time over the pandemic over the last 18 months, both in terms of the changes to work and the ways of doing business, but also the sort of financing and deal-making environment after, I guess, the shock of March last year, but then what seems in general to have been a bit of a boom in the healthcare space in general. How would you assess the last 18 months? And I guess what sort of particular challenges do you feel you've had to overcome yourselves and with your businesses? So yeah, maybe over to you, Anders, first.
Right. No, so when the pandemic hit, it was really unclear if the financial markets would function the way they had. So it's incredibly tense. And then we started working with these virtual meetings, and it turned out it works almost as good as before the pandemic. So raising money, doing all these sort of roadshows in a virtual setting, I think it has worked out remarkably well. It's probably hard to meet completely new investors that are really new to a case, but we mostly meet with investors that we have met before. So from a transactional perspective, I think it's worked out really, really well, actually. The problem, I think, has been in the Swedish market, where we started to see a downturn in the beginning of this year, I would say, when you have this sort of big sector rotation trend, people selling off biotech and tech stocks and then entering into more sort of industrial shares. I think that has been a challenge for the Swedish biotech industry. Hopefully, we have sort of passed the bottom now, so we can see more positive sentiment in the fall. But so I would say it's been remarkably good in 2020, and then unexpectedly hard in 2021 for other reasons than the pandemic, I would say.
Does that ring true for you as well, Renee, and some of the experiences you've had?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that the kind of these virtual roadshows, I mean, what they did is obviously using that platform, it kind of unblocked some of the structural issues around roadshows. I mean, you used to have to kind of actually get on a plane and go and see people. And, per definition, it would be kind of an 8 or 10 day exercise to kind of get around everywhere. And this obviously now has been, condensed into, a day or two. You can see kind of enormous amount of potential investors. So I think that the good thing is it has made it a lot more kind of effective or efficient that way. But it also obviously means that, as Anders mentioned, there was a huge amount of capital raising that was going on. And I think after kind of a period of time, I think there are two things that I guess we've found, at least in terms of being public, that comes as a consequence of that, which is, new deals is obviously what drives the market, and actually doing new deals on these roadshows, I think they're here to stay. I think that's going to be a always a very significant component of these transactions. However, kind of portfolio management is slightly different in terms of actually staying in touch with your shareholders. It's actually become a little bit harder almost in this noise to kind of find the time and get people to focus on, kind of those relationship type meetings, keeping people kind of up to speed. And I think I miss that kind of that personal connection that you actually have in a physical meeting. And I think it's much harder to kind of do that, to fit into people's calendars. It's like, people have 10 minutes here or 15 minutes there. And I mean, it gets, you wonder if they even remember who they spoke to at the end of the day. And so I think that part has been more challenging and not kind of as helpful. It's things that are not purely execution driven, I think is harder. I think the other thing, again, I think generally from a macro perspective, obviously 2020, was a huge year for biotech and for capital raising, and in general. I do think that 2021 has obviously proven to be a lot more challenging, and I also think it's driven by, the GameStop phenomenon, the Robinhood, and I mean, it's just, you have volatility that's coming from, from places that people didn't, previously expect or kind of take into account. So clearly, I think you've had a market that has had a combination of a high volatility and then this kind of off-risking, that's kind of come with that. And so also obviously the fact that, we are supposedly moving out of the kind of, pandemic, and that should give a boost to stocks that, are more into, hospitality and traveling. But I think, again, you're now it feels like we're kind of not really sure where we are, because the pandemic certainly hasn't gone away. Things have improved, but it hasn't improved as much as people thought it was going to improve. And what is it going to look like? So I think that it's a pretty kind of cloudy and difficult environment at the moment to navigate, simply because there is a lot of unknowns and uncertainty. And as we know, those are probably the two things that the market likes the least. The market is able to deal with bad news, pretty efficiently and effectively, and good news, but the kind of in between, makes people pretty nervous and pretty difficult to kind of figure out how to manage. So I think it'll be a very interesting time, going forward, to see actually kind of where we end up, because I think at some point in time also, we have to get into a somewhat of a stable, environment with the pandemic, and decide how we're going to manage it and what we're going to do and not do. So it'll be interesting to see kind of where the markets go from here, and how, they've been incredibly resilient so far, as we know, and they've been able to deal with this quite well. But it's interesting to kind of see how long that might be, how long that, might continue to be the case, I guess.
Intrigued to hear your thoughts as well, Martin, both on this sort of volatility piece, but also on the, I guess, how you've maybe going back to the deal you did with Cassie Pharmaceuticals, and big deal sort of across borders when not being able to meet, and how you found that sort of experience. Was that someone you knew before? Was that a long-term relationship, or something that happened during the pandemic? Maybe dig into that a little.
Okay. So things obviously have changed for sure. So as Anders and also René mentioned, so lots of through this Teams or Zoom. But from a BioInvent perspective, actually it has gone very well. So we did this big financing 2021, late summer, and then subsequently Q1 this year, another one. And maybe we were just happy or lucky with timing, basically, but worked very well. And then I would say from transaction perspective, financing, no issues so far from a BioInvent perspective. And then on deal making, so you mentioned Kasi, that was an interesting one. So, all the main discussions, with the chairman, Kasi's chairman, Wei Wu, CBO, CMO, that was all done by Zoom or Teams. I had a couple of meetings with their foot soldier BD guy before, but that was just getting to know each other, and then basically all the discussions with the key people was all done like this, and also successfully implemented. And I think what makes things there a little bit easier, so Kasi obviously is a nice blend because it's a Nasdaq listed company focusing on the opportunities on the China market. So they follow the same regulations and rules as, BioInvent. So that makes things much easier, very simple actually. But then I think what was also very interesting to see for me, because now we're already working together, 2 clinical development teams, because Kasi is pushing ahead. They want to file an IND for China by the end of the year, and then they become a part of our global clinical development program for BI-1206. And the teams, they have never met. It's just by Teams or Zoom, and it works extraordinarily well, I have to say. And of course, could go also exactly the other way, but in this case, it really worked. And obviously, everybody is looking forward to meet in person at some time point, but that probably will take some time because at least currently, I'm not so optimistic that things will change because vaccination is just going too slow. Once that is really pushing ahead, I think then, we should be fine. So I think it worked quite well. And obviously then we did our other collaboration with Merck, which is our second. So we have one around BI-1206. Now we also have one around BI-1808, 2 different first-in-class immuno-oncology compounds. And that was easier because we already had a collaboration with Merck. That was obviously also all done by Zoom and Teams. And the third thing I want to mention, because that is actually quite interesting. So obviously with all the money that we raised, we grew the company, especially the clinical development team. Got a lot of key positions on board, regulatory, clinical operations, etc., etc. And all this hire were done, of course, without meeting in person. So I'm today in Lund since a long time, and met a lot of those people first time face to face, as Anish was meeting his CEO just the other day. And that is kind of interesting. And I agree with René. So I think for me, it's also important to have the direct person-to-person contact, because then you see the body language, you build up the chemistry in a much different way. But if you have to do it that way, that we're now using, it works. It works extraordinarily well, at least. So I was surprised. I never thought that was possible. But we're really pushing ahead and executing, and things are running. And of course, one component of it, since Sweden was always very open as a society, also during the pandemic, obviously it had its price. And that helped a lot, at least BioInvent, because we have everything under one roof, as you know, discovery, preclinical development, manufacturing, and then, of course, the clinical development. And if we would have been forced to close down, that would have caused a lot of hiccup. So like this, we could just operate as usual, because almost 99% of the people are based anywhere in Lund. So just me and the CMO who was somewhere else. And of course, now I'm back here. And like this, we didn't have much impact. So, there's a lot of this question, do we have any impacts on, clinical trials? Just a little, really. So we really continued because we are addressing high unmet needs, and we basically could really nicely execute on our plans. But that was due to that we could keep the company open. I think that was very important, very crucial.
Interesting. Now I'm keen to sort of dig back a little bit further in the last 18 months or so. And I guess one thing that sort of struck me as I was sort of building this session, and I guess the focus on the Nordic region specifically, and how it seems to be under this sort of greater international focus, but it was a little bit about the sort of relative growth stories of each of your sort of companies. Some, founded a little bit earlier, having sort of slower, more organic, smoother growth, and then perhaps Calliditas and dual listing quite quickly after a listing in Stockholm, and a slightly faster trajectory, I suppose. So I was just keen to sort of understand a little in terms of the Nordic context at the Nordic Congress, as we are, perhaps some of those growth stories, but also maybe the challenges and indeed the opportunities as you see it for your businesses in being Nordic companies. And then, if it rings true to you that there's been this more international interest, I suppose, in the Nordic region specifically, and that's been increasing as you've been with your businesses. So maybe Anders first, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I guess, we've been around for a long time in Sweden, and I think that has been a strength. Sweden has a lot of really talented R&D staff, and coming from like the likes of Pharmacia and AstraZeneca, etc. and relatively cheap, I would say. Salaries are not astronomical in Sweden, so you can really find talented people at good rates. So that's a core strength, I think. Then yeah, the Nordic market has worked quite well for financing companies. Obviously, there have been tons of listings and a lot of capital flowing in. I still think that's has been a really core strength of the Nordic markets. What we don't see in Sweden as a problem, that's sort of the more challenging part, is like long-term owners, like the likes of Novo or Lundbeck Foundation or something like that. We typically don't have those long-term owners that can step in. Investor has been such an owner, owning Swedish Orphan by Vitrum, that they are now selling. So I'm a little bit concerned about sort of the infrastructure for building long-term companies. You need to have long-term owners as well. The pension funds are really, really supportive, but they're not really specialized in sort of running growing biotech companies. So that would be my concern. The capital markets have been working well, but longer term, I do think we need to see sort of more better owners coming into the market if we're going to succeed over the next decade or so.
Agree. And maybe just a comment here from my side. So absolutely agree, Anders. So BioInvent obviously is also around for quite some time and has been supported by very loyal, smaller Swedish investors as well as larger investors. And what I try to do when I joined is really to also complement that with long-term owners, as you call them. And I think we managed quite well. So we got HVM on board, Omega, and then also big funds from the US. But then also AP4 is large at BioInvent, Robur, Swedbank Robur, Handelsbanken, Invus. So I think it's a very nice mix, and we're very proud of our large institutional shareholder base. And that was exactly the motivation behind it, to really get stability. Because if you want to push ahead with clinical development and maybe Scaliditas later, then also commercialization, you need long-term horizon, and you have to plan not only year after year, you need to make plans for years. So we have a runway now until the end of 2024. And that allows us really to make good planning and not be driven by the immediate milestones in order to tick them off to raise new funds, because that might not be the right milestones really in order to develop a corporation. So I think long-term share owners are very, very important. So I think you have to have the right mix of institutions and smaller retail investors. But I think it's possible, at least within BioInvent, we have now a really nice mix of high-class European, Nordic, as well as US investors.
And yeah, over to you, Renee.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with all of this. I think that, one of the points that I want to pick up on probably that Anders mentioned is, I think that, we've been, lucky to some extent in Sweden that we have had this opportunity to kind of create a bit of a network of a core kind of set of biotech companies. I think that's also brought interest from both Europe and the US to actually look at some of these companies in the Nordic region. And there are a lot of smaller and public entities, more so I think than in any other region really in the biotech arena. So I think it's like everything else, it gets a certain amount of substance, and then that kind of will actually draw in interest, more broadly from abroad. I think in terms of, as also mentioned, in terms of long-term owners, I do think obviously there's a difference between kind of a Novo and a Lundbeck, and then kind of, in a US hedge fund. I mean, they clearly do not exactly have the same strategies. I do think that, in the Scandinavian or the Swedish kind of market, I think that I would almost put those kind of, institutional holders somewhere in the middle, actually. I think that I think the European holders tend to be overall more loyal for a longer period of time than in the US. I think that US funds obviously have a lot of depth of capital, and with, there's clearly, again, in the US, there are, a group of shareholders who are very long-term and very committed, but there's also obviously a lot of pockets of capital in the US that's pretty opportunistic and kind of comes and goes in a fairly kind of rapid manner. So I think it really takes, to Martin's point, I think you really have to try to think about how you want to build your shareholder base longer term, to the extent that you have that, luxury, because not everybody has that luxury to do that. But I do think it's something that you should try and keep in mind as much as you possibly can, and start as early as you can, to try to balance that. Because again, you also know we have to realize as public companies, a lot of our shareholders are going, they're in the business of making money, right? They are going to want to sell. They're not going to want to sit here, for the love of the molecule for 20 years, right? So, I think we have to be realistic about how we're going to allow our shareholders also to kind of, transfer out of the company, et cetera. So I think that, I think it's something that is a long-term plan that you have to kind of keep on looking at, and be aware of the different kind of components in your capital structure. So I think that's something that I think you have to think about, irrespective. But I think in the Nordic region, to Anders' point, right? If you really want to build a really bigger business, and I think that's obviously a combination of, your spend is very different if you're doing preclinical. You can certainly do 4 preclinical programs, try and run 4 phase 3 programs on a global basis. The amount of money that you're spending then on a kind of monthly basis is obviously, huge. Does that capital base really exist in Sweden? Can you get to that point of capital? And I think that's kind of, I guess, the question. Do you not necessarily? I think you probably need to, move outside of the Scandinavian region in order to get access to that amount of kind of capital. And I think that is a limiting factor in terms of how much late stage clinical work can you really have ongoing at the same time. Because again, I think that drives obviously again a little bit of how you look at your capital base from the Nordics. And I think my last point is obviously again the Anders point. I think again, the people from Astra, Pharmacia, et cetera. I think yes, I think they're extremely kind of important. They have been extremely important for the kind of growth in the Nordic region over the last 10 years in terms of that. I think the sad thing is, we don't have those companies anymore. So who's training the next generation of late stage clinical development expertise, of late stage regulatory, commercial, market access, and who's training them in Sweden? And I think that's, that I guess is a little bit of a question mark for me is, where are we supposed to find, the 35-year-old, head of a division that's actually been running large global trials, in Scandinavia. And so I don't think that, we don't have a huge pool, I don't think, to kind of, for the next 10 years, potentially.
Has COVID accelerated that move, with digital working and things of people working across borders? Could you see more, there's a huge pool of that sort of experience in the US, for example, more, remote working from US sort of people in those roles, do you think? To Renee, as you posed the question, but also to everyone else.
I think that actually doing that in the US, I think that, there are quite a lot of cultural differences between Sweden and the US. I think that you can absolutely, and I think all companies have, right? Martin, but you go and seek senior talent elsewhere, right? So I think that is part and parcel of what we all have to do. We have to go out and do that. But I think in terms of having a core operational role, sitting in a different time zone, I just don't see how that works. I think that maybe in Europe you can do it, but I would not think that the US is a viable solution long term anyway.
Just a quick comment on talent. So you're right, Renee. I think that will be a challenge. Who's training the next level or the next generation? But currently, I still see, because we just went through this and we hired a number of people. Still, I think at the moment, Sweden and in the broader Nordics, you still find very good talent, at least when I think about clinical development, clinical operations, regulatory. But, long term, it will become a challenge, I agree. And then a quick other comment regarding the shareholder base. So you're absolutely right. So if you do preclinical work, discovery, That obviously will be very well supported. That's the start. But if I think in the context of BioInvent, we are now running 4 clinical programs. By the end of the year, 5 clinical programs, and that's why we had to broaden our shareholder base and include large European such as HBM or US such as Redmile. But I think one point I also want to make. So BioInvent already early on had one very supportive shareholder, which was Van Herk. They have been with the company for a long time. They're also large, and I think they're also now quite broad in a couple of Swedish companies. So at the end, it's really the mix. So you need, some dynamics. You need some people who are really sticking with you. And obviously, when I joined and I propagated the portfolio strategy that we are pushing now ahead with, at the beginning, I faced a lot of pressure, especially from the smaller shareholders. They basically said, well, just focus on one program. That's it. And I said, well, I'm not interested in that because BioInvent has the platform that we can really use. And then, luckily I found then traction. First larger European such as HBM and then also the US came on board with Redmile, Invus and Consonance. So it's a journey after all, and then you have to basically try everything. But it's the right mix. And I think it's also quite important as a message to everybody out there. So you have to do it proactively. So very often I meet with smaller companies, and I have also some smaller companies elsewhere in the Nordics. They're going kind of opportunistically. They get approached by investors, and then they do whatever is necessary in order to get the money in. But I think you really have to plan long term ahead. So you have to have ambitious plans. Hopefully, you get support for that, and then you also plan when you do your financing. So just to give you an example, we just did last summer a big financing, and then we knew our Q1 data is coming up. Obviously, we knew what the quality of the data will be. And then we already prepared ahead that we will do at the same time when we announce, do another financing. And then we basically exploited this event in order to get another big chunk money into the company. And that's what I mean with proactive planning. I think that's quite important.
Any comments on this? I think we've covered a few things since we last heard from you. Any sort of additional points on top there?
No, so Martin is in a slightly different position than René and I am. Being in a commercial phase, the tickets are suddenly much bigger. So we've been trying to reach out to investors for years and years, and we have a strong investor base. But still, I would still love to have a big anchor that I could have, like a Van Herk, if they would have been our supporters. We're owned by HealthCap and Industrifonden. They have been our main shareholders. They were great in the initial phase, but they don't have the firepower to keep supporting us in this phase, and that is a challenge in our case when it comes to raising money. Other than that, I think to have a successful biotech cluster in the Nordic region, I think we need some new success stories, like a company that launches a product and it sells for more than, I'd say, like $100 million or something like that. And we have several companies now that have a shot at that. So hopefully 1 or 2 of those will actually succeed. And I think that could be sort of the big cornerstones of the new generation of the companies that can actually grow and be long-term sustainable and train the new young people to take over from the current generation. So we'll hopefully René or I or both or someone who has a commercial product on the market or very close to the market will be successful. I think that's something that is really needed to keep that sort of a positive spiral going in the Nordic region.
If you look from a European perspective, actually, if you compare the various regions, I think the Nordics come out quite well in a European perspective. If you look at the number of companies, also at what stages those companies are, because, and of course, another very successful cluster is the Netherlands and Belgium. But the Nordics are doing quite well, so that also has to be said. But of course, I agree. So we need more success, and products would be, of course, the best. That would be the ultimate proof. But we're actually in a good cluster, I would say.
I'd be keen to maybe sort of dive a little bit deeper into that with the time we have left in terms of this sort of these first launches and this sort of trend in general, but also the Nordic region and I guess this, how it does sort of match up across Europe. There's actually a presentation from McKinsey happening tomorrow morning where they've been doing a report on exactly some of these topics that we're discussing. But we have had a question which might be a little hard potentially for some of you to answer, given how long you've been at the respective businesses, but maybe just from your past experiences as well. In terms of fundraising, this is the question. In terms of fundraising, is there anything you might have done differently earlier on in your journey, or any advice or things to avoid for younger companies or CEOs looking to raise perhaps their Series A rounds? Any sort of advice you'd have given, or things you might have chosen to do differently in retrospect when sort of doing more earlier stage fundraising? I don't know if anyone can any pearls of wisdom to share.
I can start. Yeah.
Martin might be the best to start, and then we'll fill in.
Okay, so obviously, if I just look at the BioInvent financing history, so the one that I basically did together with the team here, that was since August 2018. I wouldn't have done anything different. I think it worked very well. We started with a combined directed and rights issue, which was not the best one, but gave us money. So just to give you a little bit of the history there, in order to basically build the company through 2018, 19 into 2020. Then basically we put the company on the map. We had the new story. We showed to the market that we could deliver milestones. And I think that was then the basis for the big financing that we did last summer, which brought then on board, HPM and a couple of good Nordics, and of course also the current investors. And then that, of course, then was another step for then the bigger investment in Q1 this year. So I think from that perspective, I wouldn't do anything different. And I would just repeat what I said. So I think, and I have done this myself when I was a young CEO the first time. So this is my third company. Then you tend to be rather opportunistic regarding funding. So you think, okay, it's money that you need, and then you just push in order to get some finance into the company, and then you don't spend too much time to really build, or to take the time to build a good shareholder structure, with the right mix, as we already have mentioned. And then, of course, also, this goes hand in hand with how you build the strategy around that. So I think the other thing is then to be really proactive. That means to have a long-term strategy and long-term plan, which sometimes is very tough. And I agree with what René has said earlier. There's, of course, sometimes you don't have the luxury. Sometimes you just have to survive, basically, and then you take in whatever you can take in. But here at BioInvent, what was the number one was the quality of the investor, and then the money. So it was really that we made sure that we get a high-quality institutional shareholder base, which we have now. And then, money was, of course, also important, but it was really, I would say, at least on par, maybe even a little bit secondary. And sometimes I agree, again, with René, you don't have the luxury. Sometimes you just have to survive, and then you take the money when whatever you can, in order to make sure that you come to the next step. And that was, in a way, what we did when we did the first financing, which was a combined rights and directed issue, because there we just needed money. It was fully guaranteed. It was not the best financing, but gave us the money in order to build for the second and third financing, which then raised the big checks.
And I think the one thing I would say in terms of in an early stage of a company, I think that the venture capital community in Europe looks very different now than what it did 5-6 years ago. There are a lot of funds that actually they were very well capitalized. And I think also there's quite a lot of connections between kind of European funds and US funds, et cetera, on kind of the private side. And so I think that, if you're building a company and you're in an earlier stage, so you're not having to raise enormous amounts of money for, commercialization, et cetera, you're in a completely different part of your stage. I think you should think about, is going public early really the best thing here? I think actually a lot of times, people go public much too early, and they forget about the fact that actually that puts you on a road of having to do continuous capital raisings in that environment. And you have to be pretty sure and pretty convinced that you can manage to do that, and that your clinical programs can support it. Because actually you do need a lot of, need news flow and data, et cetera, to be able to raise money. So unless you kind of can see this, ahead of you in a way that kind of makes sense, I think that, there's a lot of I think companies, rushing to become a public company, and then I think life can become extremely complicated and difficult being stuck, kind of in a too early stage as a public entity, if there are delays in the clinical program or surprises, etc. So I think my suggestion would be really to kind of try to, and also to Anders' point, if you can find, large pockets of supportive shareholders that are long-term, maybe starting on a private side, Lundbeck, Novo, HealthCap, whatever. I mean, we don't have maybe that many in the Scandinavian region, but I also think that, there's no reason why you wouldn't be able to, to go to, other clusters in Europe, etc., with these ideas and have these conversations and start these relationships early. Because I mean, good science can always be financed, and I don't think necessarily that it has to be someone that lives next to you. And so I think I would encourage people to think a little bit more long term, and really try to see, if the private route is a more helpful place to be in an early stage of a company's development.
100% agreed. 100% agreed. So I think you have to have a certain maturity in order to be listed. You mentioned news flow, and I think that is earliest if you're doing therapeutic development. Once you have clinical programs, and then just if you have one, that could be also quite tough, because then it's a one-trick pony. So I think it should be a portfolio. And then the other thing is, yes, absolutely, there's a lot of good private investors. So with the company that was running before, BioInvent was a Irish-based private company. We had good access to capital, no problem. We have all these corporate venture funds from the pharmaceutical industry, as well as the ones that you mentioned. But also there, I think the point that you made, it should be long term. So I think you can use those funds, and especially when you're based in the Nordics, what I see in Norway very often, their company almost pushed at some time point to go at the stock exchange, because you don't have the access to capital anymore through the private. And I think probably similar a little bit in Sweden, maybe with some exceptions. And then also you have to make the planning that you again get the right mix, that you are not forced to go public, because you'll have not only Nordics but maybe also European VCs that can support you for a longer time, such that you can build to a stage where it makes sense to be listed.
And we're getting towards the end here. It's time's flown very quickly on this session. I think we've covered a lot of ground. I've got, I guess, two last questions. One, as I said, I was keen to sort of briefly dive into this sort of first launch and also the sort of commercial strategy, both in the US and Europe, and that success story piece as well that you mentioned, Anders. But my final question is going to be around a little bit of a gaze into the crystal ball. So maybe start thinking about that, what we can expect or what you might hope from your companies through the rest of 21 and 2022. But I guess maybe this is mostly directed at Renee and Anders here. So this sort of first launch trend of companies, going solo, launching products is something that we've seen quite a lot more of recently, both US companies doing it, but also now European companies doing it and going to the US. Renee, you mentioned that's always been the strategy with Calliditas and launching in the US as well. But I've seen a lot of interesting talk around the sort of having a concurrent US and European strategy at the same time. And I guess, to what extent do you feel that this sort of, building these success stories relies on, that you mentioned, Anders, these success stories rely on having a product launched in the US, or it could also be launched in Europe and then following on with the US? Or do you think they need to be run concurrently, or could they be separate? And I guess, to what extent do you think that the US is that ultimate, the key success story that would help kick the Nordic region even further into the spotlight?
Well, if I start, for us, the US market is by far the bigger one, and that's where you can get reimbursement straight away. So of course, that is sort of the clear beacon that you go for in the beginning. However, the European markets are commercially interesting, but you just have to do it at a different pace. If you go for US, you go big straight away. Whereas in Europe, you can do a stepwise approach. Start with Germany and Austria in both, or since Germany is pretty big, that gives you a foothold, and then you take it stepwise from there. I'd see a couple of €100 million in potential revenues for our product in Europe. Maybe that's not great from an, I don't know, Pfizer or AstraZeneca perspective. For us, that's a huge opportunity. So if you can do that in a proper way, it should not be forgotten. But I do have respect for the strategy of Calliditas that is somewhat different. So maybe I should let René comment on that.
I think again it comes from a little bit of where do you come from and what are your resources and what does it look like and what's realistic under the circumstances. And again, I think also looking at the amount of capital that's available. So I guess from my perspective and from Calliditas' perspective, the benefit, as Anders says, I mean, in the US, it's a very large market. It's a complex market. All markets are complex. It's complicated in terms of getting reimbursement, the whole market access, all of this. But it is a large kind of cohesive market that you can kind of attack as a smaller company. You can get that kind of resource in the US and launch it. And obviously also it does tend to be, therefore a huge market opportunity as well and is on its own right. In Europe, I think it is a much more, from a kind of operations and execution perspective, it's far more complicated and fragmented and costly because each market, you can't have kind of a group of Germans, marketing in France, right? I mean, you literally have to have, separate teams in pretty much in every kind of, almost every country. And every country has their own rules around reimbursement and sales and distribution, et cetera. So it does become a much more complicated, effort operationally, as far as I'm concerned. And I also have, unfortunately, having been in this business for a long, long time, I have been on a lot of boards of companies that have tried to do this in Europe over the years. And so I've seen firsthand in terms of the difficulties that you can run into with regards to this. And so I think from a resource perspective, I guess our choice really was to put all of our focus and our resources in order to kind of build a commercial company in the US and then partner with companies in Europe that already has this expertise with regards to market access and commercial resources. And I think having one product that's also a rare product, I think makes it even a little bit more complicated from a kind of execution perspective in Europe, because that product either needs to be incredibly high priced, I guess, and super rare. Maybe you can do it then, but I think it's not obvious to me how you actually ultimately make money in Europe on a one kind of product basis. I think it can take quite a long time, and that's why we actually chose to partner with someone that already has all of this infrastructure in place. And again, because we're not kind of based in Boston, we're not a US company, we haven't grown up as a US company. I think we wanted to make sure that, the capital that we needed to launch and to build this organization was achievable, from where we were sitting a couple of years ago. And I think that's why we kind of made these choices. And so, things can always change. I mean, if you become a bigger company with a broader portfolio, to Martin's point, I think then, maybe you have to rethink some of those strategies, but that's really kind of why we ended up where we ended up at the time.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, we are coming to the end here. We have our next session starting in just 7 minutes time. So I want to say a huge thank you to Anders and to René and to Martin for joining and sharing their expertise and experience with you all and some of their stories. As I said, the final question from me will be on a little bit of a sort of gaze into the crystal ball. And I guess, what would you hope to see from your businesses? What do you hope and expect to see from your businesses over the next sort of 18 months or so through to the end of 2022? Where would you love to be, if you were sat here to December 2022, what would you love to be saying you've achieved in the next 18 months? Maybe I'll go to Martin first.
Okay, so let's first focus on, there we are looking forward to update on around our lead program BI-1206. That will be towards the end of the year. 2 studies, non-Hodgkin lymphoma as well as the solid cancer study. And then probably beginning of next year, then the data from the new trials will tick in, BT-001, which is our collaboration with Transgene's oncologic device program combined with our proprietary anti-CTLA-4, and BI-1808, which is a very interesting program, since the target is TNF receptor 2, which is one of the hot and upcoming IO targets. And then as we go further, we said 21, 22, of course, since we have a portfolio, so by the end of the year, we will have 5 clinical programs. And of course, they all generate data that we will then, present at the various time points. So we will have quite a rich news flow going forward. And then we also will remain active in partnering, and we'll see what we can do.
And Renee?
Well, for me, it's a pretty simple answer to that question, actually, where I would like to be at the end of next year. Obviously, we would like to have had an accelerated approval of our lead product in the US and in Europe, and we would have, conducted a successful launch in the US of the product. And towards the end of next year, we would be, quickly heading towards cash flow break even. Hopefully, that we could have a view on seeing that kind of happening. And so I think that would be very exciting. And I think that ultimately, obviously, also would, from a kind of life sciences perspective, the idea of kind of having a cash flow, kind of generating part of the business, obviously gives you, a lot of independence and freedom as to kind of the capital raising and how you then kind of, use that capital to kind of, create further value and build a business. So I think that would that would clearly kind of be where I would like to see myself at the end of the year next year, and we would also then have launched. We would be running another pivotal trial in PBC, and we would be coming up to kind of the futility analysis of that trial, going into kind of the last kind of part of the phase 3 trial, hopefully. We would also have seen some data coming off of the proof of concept trial, hopefully, or getting to the point where we might see that. So hopefully we'll see that in 2022. And I think if we can actually do that translational work from preclinical to clinical and see an impact of these kind of cancer-associated fibroblasts, I think that would give us an extremely exciting platform that we can then also develop further.
Fantastic. And others?
Yeah, so even simpler answer. We need to overcome our current sort of regulatory hurdles, get approval with a broader label in the US, and sell a lot of Pepaxti, because it really is a drug that can provide a lot of benefits. So that's, of course, what we want to see. And of course, then also get approval in Europe and start selling in Germany and Austria towards the second half of next year.
Fantastic. Well, my thanks again to our panel here of Anders, Martin, and Renee. Thank you all for joining and listening in. Please do keep engaging. Please do keep asking questions on the platform and getting involved throughout. Our next session starts in just 3 minutes. We'll be hearing from some investors for the first time and a little bit on the investment landscape from the mouths of investors. So please do join us at 11 o'clock. Thanks again to the panel, and see you shortly.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you, Josh.
Bye.
Bye-bye.